Welcome to Worship Quest Wednesdays, a series addressing topics related to worship, spiritual formation, and theology. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell to be notified when new videos are posted. On today's episode, we will be discussing contemporary praise and worship. Our guests are Lester Ruth and Swee. Lester Ruth started out as a pastor with an interest in worship history and has become a worship historian who maintains pastoral sensibilities. His heartfelt commitment is to use the wealth of the history of worship to enrich the worship of Christian congregations today. Most of his publications have dealt with worship in the earliest centuries of Christianity or among American evangelicals or Pentecostals of the last 200 years. He is also deeply interested in showing contemporary songwriters the marvels of classic worship songs and doctrines to spark their creative imaginations for new songs. He likes to play the djembe and congas, but admits that he's not very good, although enthusiastic. He is the research professor of Christian worship at Duke Divinity School. Prior to teaching, he served several pastorates in Texas, and he holds a doctorate in worship history from the University of Notre Dame. Lester, thanks for being here today.
My great pleasure to be with you.
Swee is from Singapore, now based in Canada. He started out as a music director serving in a Singapore Methodist church that had multiple worship services in both traditional Methodist and praise and worship styles. Subsequently, God provided him with numerous opportunities to be involved in teaching and worship music leadership roles all over the world, including being on the editorial team that created the official hymnal of the Methodist Church in Cambodia. In his research and teaching ministry, Swee is interested in post-colonial contextual worship music practices. In this area, he examines worship music making as it shapes Christian identity and spirituality around the globe. With degrees in both sacred music and liturgical studies, Swee has been involved in helping local churches and international ecumenical conferences, such as the 2011 World Methodist Conference in Durban, South Africa, and the 11th Assembly of the World Council of Churches in 2022, to experience heartfelt worship music making. Presently, he is the Deer Park Associate Professor of Sacred Music at Emmanuel College of Victoria University in the University of Toronto, and he's the director of the Master of Sacred Music program. Thanks for being here, Swee.
Thank you for having me, Stephen.
I'm really excited about our conversation today. Really premier worship historians here in our presence, and excited that you have a brand new book that just came out within the past couple months, A History of Contemporary Praise and Worship. And it amazes me that we can have a history of contemporary praise and worship. It's interesting that contemporary praise and worship has been around long enough to actually do a history, let alone a history that is filled with this many pages. It can be filled with this history.
Stephen, that's really just the first volume that needs to be written. It's just the North American history. The worldwide history still needs to be researched and written.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good. So why don't we begin by talking about the scope of your book, or the big picture of the vision of what this book is about, A History of Contemporary Praise and Worship. Either one of you can jump in.
Well, at the risk of dissuading people from actually buying and reading the book, let me start with saying what it's not.
Okay.
So it's not a detailed history of musicians, songs, and albums. There's music in the book, but the lens is actually on a different question. What was the scriptural motivation to develop this new way of worship? And that's what the book is really about, told in two parallel stories
Okay.
Until the very last chapter.
Yeah. Good. Swee Hong, how would you describe your book to someone who's asking about it?
I think what is exciting for me as a musician, right? I mean, since this book is not about music, is to see where this particular worship phenomenon has its origin, and how does this worship phenomenon take. I think we like to. It's like a kind of a onion that we want to peel open and see. Okay, where's the core of this particular worship phenomenon? And so when we began working on this particular book project, what amazed me was that where we thought was the beginning was not the beginning.
Oh, good.
And so we got more and more excited as we began to start peeling open the fruit and seeing where is the kernel of this particular worship phenomenon. So that's exciting. I think if people are really serious in terms of if they want to understand where their worship came from, this is the book to crack open and read.
Yeah, great. Now, Lester, you mentioned that the book is framed with two parallel theological or scriptural traditions. So will you tell us about those two parallel theological scriptural traditions that drive the two histories?
Sure. One of them is very Pentecostal and has Pentecostal roots. And it's a theology based on Psalm 22:3 as the foundational verse, that God is the Holy One who inhabits the praises of his people.
Sure.
And so it's this link between communal praising of God and experiencing the inhabitation of God, the presence of God.
Yeah.
There's an alternative translation that talks about God being enthroned upon the praises of his people. And some people emphasize that. That's the root notion. And once we discovered that, it was almost like a black hole in a way. It just started sucking in, or no, it pulled back the curtain and allowed some significant historic figures and churches and books and resources to come to the forefront. But that was only part of the story, because we found a whole different group of people for whom the key verse wasn't Psalm 22:3. It was 1 Corinthians 9:22, where Paul says he's going to become all things to all people so that he might win some.
Sure.
And if the first approach is about how do you get God to be present, the second approach is about how do you get people to be present.
Sure.
And it's about creative adaptation and kind of cultural adaptation and creativity in order to make worship services appealing and attractive to folks. And we thought about, in fact, Swee Hong and I went to a conference on worship technology in Dallas. We knew the stories. We knew all the kind of the raw materials. We couldn't figure out how to piece it all together without causing whiplash in the reader, just having to jerk their heads back and forth every chapter or within the chapter. So we just decided to kind of separate it out into two parallel stories until what we saw is kind of a merger, a fusion of the two occurring mid to late 1990s.
Good. Yeah, and you call that in your book the confluence of both of these coming together, these two streams come together. And so what does that look like? How do you unpack that?
It looks like today.
Yeah.
Where everyone has a CCLI license and everyone's using the same companies to buy their worship-related technology, and there are common song sources that everyone uses, and there's even a common sort of style that's expected. So and not just musically, but in terms of informality, updated English. So the confluence looks like today. And I'm hoping people will read the book, particularly if they're a younger worship leader, so that this is the only world that they've ever grown up in. All they know is the confluence. This book will help give the backstory. the rest of the story, to quote Paul Harvey from the old radio show.
That's right.
This is this is this is the information on how we got to the current state of things.
And it's not just about for the longest time, scholarship has always looked at the 1960s as the origin of this particular movement. What is different in our book is that with Lessa and I, we actually pushed it right back to the 40s.
Wow.
And what's even more interesting is that this particular movement had its roots in Vancouver, Canada. I mean, man, that's a good thing.
There you go.
Right? I mean, I mean, whoever realizes that something good can come out of Vancouver. So this is a story that we tell, and I think if you are intrigued about how worship, this particular phenomenon came about, then this is a book to really look at. It makes Canadians proud.
Yeah, we uncovered some really interesting stories. For instance, there was a missionary lady, Kay Gordon, who 1955, 1956, one of those 2 years, decided she had a missionary call to take praise and worship to the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic.
Wow.
So one of my favorite lines that I've written subsequently to the book is, while the Jesus people were just learning their ABCs in the mid-1950s,
right,
the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic were already becoming masters of praise and worship.
There you go.
Just push the narrative much farther back, and I think we complexify the story too, don't you think, Swee Hong?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah. It's not just the expected cast of characters. You're going to meet some significant people whose influence was very strong, but oftentimes are just largely forgotten.
Sure. Yeah, you don't normally think of the Arctic when you think of contemporary praise and worship.
Oh, yeah.
No, I mean, that's the surprising. They're doing praise and worship in the Canadian Arctic than they are in Orange County, where you're currently living.
Yeah.
You know, because everybody thinks, well, Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, the early Vineyard, that's the origins. Right. But there's a whole generation and a half prior to that who are already doing it. It's in Asia, it's in Europe, it's in Africa,
right,
South America from the late 1940s and the 1950s.
Wow.
Yeah, and people like to think that Hillsong is a big deal, is a big thing, right? Because they are all over the world. In our book, you will get to learn about this Chinese expression from this particular organization in LA, Streams of Praise Music Ministries, that has its vision, the 1.2 billion people of Chinese descent in the world. That's their market. That's their focus. For sure. So if you talk about who is bigger, I would say the big block that's in LA, the Streams of Praise Music Ministries is a major player. But we don't realize that. But this book will actually show you why they are such a major player in this particular worship phenomenon. Yeah.
Speaking of Hillsong, we're just on a roll now, Stephen. I hope.
All right, go for it. That's what we're here for.
You know, and Hillsong is big. You're not saying that they're not.
No, I'm not. Yeah.
But if you're interested, like, what was the context out of which Hillsong emerged? So Hillsong's not like Melchizedek, you know, who had neither father nor mother. There's a pedigree of practices and perspective behind what we now know as Hillsong.
Sure.
This origins in Canada in the 1940s is actually the backdrop of Hillsong. We don't get into the main text of the book because it's really got kind of a North American focus. But if the reader will look carefully at the footnotes, they will see where the Hillsong connection would be.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
The originators of Hillsong are absorbing what's already circulating in the waters.
Sure.
Yeah.
From the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, and that makes sense that they would do that.
See, and also further on, if you look into when we think about praise and worship movement, we always associate that with the guitar. We think that, well, everybody comes with a guitar and that's praise and worship. No, 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 no. If you go back to the 1940s, they are more likely to be using piano or organ. And they will be singing in 4 parts, just a typical hymn. So you find that the idea of a hill song, the idea of praise and worship being guitar-led, that only happens from the 60s onwards.
Oh, yeah.
20 years before that, it was basically piano-driven or keyboard-driven or organ-driven kind of thing. And in 4-part singing.
Wow.
And we have evidence of that in upstate New York, even in Canada. There's songbooks that they produce. They're all in 4 parts.
Yeah.
And might surprise some of our people, in that songbook that we have seen, it includes our favorite hymns, Amazing Grace. There's a Fountain Filled with Blood. Those are traditional gospel hymns that we would sing in the mainline church. That is part of the revival that started the praise and worship movement.
Yeah.
That's right.
If the listeners are wondering, well, what makes that early form of praise and worship then, if they didn't have guitars? And it's spending 40 minutes in praising God, most of it sung, so that you experience the presence of God. That's the common thread. So one of my doctoral students the other day sent me a YouTube clip from the group Leland.
Oh, yeah.
And she said, listen to this. Right? It was a new song that I'd never heard before, sort of. But I'm listening to the song, and he gets to the chorus. And what is the chorus based on? Psalm 22:3, God inhabits praises. And I can just imagine some 22-year-old worship leader going, oh, that's a really cool song from Leland. This is completely new. And it's like, no, it's not. It's a Canadian Pentecostal preacher, January 1946.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we talked a lot about the stream of praise and worship, God inhabiting the praise of his people. What about the other side? 1 Corinthians, becoming all things to all people. We see that a lot, through this history, right?
Yep. That tends to be a history that's a little bit more evangelical, non-Pentecostal, or a little bit more mainline. And it's really a development driven by anxiety or a sense of mission.
Okay.
So that a worship service is conceived of as one of a congregation's primary way to reach people, connect with them, draw in members, and evangelize. And the particular nuance shifts whether you're talking to evangelicals or mainliners, And so the use of the 1 Corinthians 9 passage actually has a little bit longer pedigree. It goes all the way back to the 19th century. People genuinely concerned that older inherited ways of worship people find off-putting, boring, or actually counterproductive. And so they start trying to assess, what would attract people, make them feel at home, and what are ways to present the gospel so that it can be heard in ways that feel kind of culturally accessible to them. And so that's the story of folks like the Salvation Army. Amy Semple McPherson, there in Los Angeles, Angeles Temple. The Parachurch Youth Ministries of the 1940s and 50s and the 60s. And then the folks interested in this and the cultural turmoil of the late 60s, they're the ones who actually coined the term contemporary worship as a technical term in the late 60s. And there's about a 10-year period of just massive creativity and experimentation. Including, surprisingly and ironically, a worship professor that Swee and I have in common, James White, who in the generation ahead of me was the premier worship historian. We found out and discovered he was one of the main experimenters in the late 60s, early 70s, and was probably the most prolific writer
That's cool.
supporting the experimentation.
Yeah. So, Swee Hong, in terms of music in this stream, the 1 Corinthians 9 contemporary worship stream, uh, was it as simple as just mimicking the styles of music in the world in order to help people feel more comfortable when they came to church? Or is there something else going on?
Yeah, I think following on what Lester said, the whole idea of this 1 Corinthians 9:22 movement is much more of seeing a dichotomy between the Christian faith and cultural expression. And a lot of the people discovered that during that particular period of time in the 1960s, the beginning of TV, the strong pull of radio, Elvis Presley and all the bunch of people that are out there making that kind of music is pulling a lot of the young people away, so-called, from the church.
Right.
So this whole move is about, again, like what Lester said, is a strategy to try to bring them back to the fold.
Mm.
So yes, you are right. They began to adapt a lot of what they hear on radio and use it to carry. So they adopted the medium to carry the message of Christ. So you begin to see that. So the whole idea of youth musicals, you begin to hear a lot of those famous composers. I mean, when we were growing up, at least when I was a kid, right, a teenager, I would get used to hear all the different kinds of youth musicals that are out there. The whole idea of continental singers, the whole idea of campus crusade efforts, the whole idea of youth with a mission, all pivot towards that particular direction of let's develop an anchor for the young people to actually experience the Christian faith. And music becomes an avenue, which points to the fact that when you look at Christian history or Christian worship history, there are multiple ways, or I call it 3 broad streams of which people can encounter God. The beginning of the church, we are looking at how sacraments were used. Baptism, Holy Communion was one way. Then in the middle period would be what we call the rhetoric phrase. The preaching would draw people into the church to have an encounter with God, right? And then in our lifetime, the use of music as a way of encountering God. So you find that there are these 3 broad streams that are present throughout church history, that you can see that as well.
Yeah, very good.
Hey, Swee Hong, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Speaking about these youth musicals of the 60s and 70s, what would be some of the songs from those that would still circulate? It Only Takes a Spark?
Yeah, for sure.
Freely, you have
freely.
received.
Yeah. There would be what is it? What else do I remember? I cannot remember, but I know composers more than things I do. So like Jimmy Carroll Owens. For example, the whole musical of The Witness. I mean, I'm not sure whether your listeners will listen to it, but listen to The Witness. I mean, or even some musicals like Joseph and the Technicolor Code, things like that. So you actually try to convey a musical and use it as a way of engaging the people. Earlier on, when radio broadcast was a great in thing, you even have people that will actually create radio broadcasts with strong Christian content as a way of reaching out to the people. Yeah. And the whole idea of, for example, we are so used to the fact that Integrity has this orchestral sound, right? You think that, well, that's Integrity way of getting things done. No, but if you look carefully, that was already in the 60s. If you listen to the work of well-known church music composers, right? Like, let me throw some names: Jimmy and Carol Owens, Kurt Kaiser. What's the other guy that you did, Lester? Can you remember?
Ralph Carmichael.
Ralph Carmichael.
Oh, yeah.
They orchestrate and they really bring the richness of the music making. It's no longer just one piano or one guitar. It's a full orchestra. Yeah. Who will not be captivated by that?
Yeah. And I
agree.
remember for
It's
me
got to be
growing up,
good and it's got to be interesting.
Oh yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. For
So
me growing up in a Southern Baptist church, it was a small church. We wanted to do some contemporary praise and worship, but we didn't necessarily have musicians who could play at least well enough for what we thought of.
yeah.
So there was a big trend in using accompaniment
Oh
tracks
yeah.
to sing, right? I remember the very first song I sang with a small little group of friends in front of church was
Yeah.
with an accompaniment track. It was Rich Mullins' Awesome God.
Oh yeah.
When he rolls
That's
up his sleeves, he ain't just putting on the Ritz, right? And
that's
so we would,
right.
I sang to accompaniment tracks all the time.
Yes. And the Japanese word for that is karaoke, okay?
Karaoke, yeah.
You just put an earworm in my ear. I'm going to be singing that song in the back of my head for the rest of this
Exactly.
conversation, Stephen.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk through maybe some of the misconceptions of contemporary praise and worship. We already mentioned one of those, which is I know for me, when I first think of contemporary praise and worship, the first thought that pops in my head is the Jesus People or Calvary Chapel, Vineyard, but you've already mentioned that this was more widespread even before the 1960s and 70s when the Jesus People were coming into what did you say? They were learning their ABCs and this was already
While,
being done.
while people across the globe were already mastering praise and worship,
Yeah,
the first Jesus people were only 5 or 6 years old and learning their ABCs in kindergarten.
yeah, yeah. So this has a really a rich history already that we're seeing.
Yeah, and
80
I think
years
it's a
worth.
useful kind of revision. I've really been thinking a lot about this, and as I've continued to write on the topic and give conference papers, I'm really trying to place the Jesus people piece as part of a larger story.
Mhm.
And I've been committed to that because I think it's a better history. But it dawned on me it's a more it's a better theological explanation too.
Mhm.
Because if you really double down on the Jesus people, it becomes a history about cultural turmoil
Mm.
and the hippie subculture, and God doing an amazing thing into being able to bring some hippies out of that, which
Yeah,
was an amazing story.
yeah, absolutely.
But it really becomes about cultural conflict and about music.
Mhm.
What we've discovered is that the key story is about the Bible
Yeah.
and grappling and wrestling with the Bible. And as soon as you could do that, it places this history not only into a broader context to explain this particular worship phenomenon, but the entire history of Christian worship.
Mhm.
Because grappling with the scripture and wanting to make sure that your worship is scriptural is just a common Protestant sensibility of the last 500 years. And this is just a new chapter in that larger story.
Mhm.
Did that make sense? If you double down on the Jesus people, you almost isolate the story.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting because that leads into kind of a second misconception that I was thinking through was a lot of times in terms of music, when we think of traditional hymns, we think good theology. And we think of contemporary praise and worship choruses and we think shallow theology. But what you just said there was contemporary praise and worship is really founded upon scripture,
Yes,
right?
the soundness of the theology is not only just in the lyrical text, it's in the scriptural imagination, backdrop, and motivation that's bringing you to the worship of God.
Mm,
And that's where the solidness is.
yeah,
And it's not without question, if I want to take off my historian hat and put on my theological pastoral hat,
mhm,
there are some potential hiccups in the theology,
sure.
but it's much more substantial than people first give it credit for. And even the repetition is serving a particular theological purpose. You know, Consider the Song of the Angels in Isaiah 6.
Mhm.
You know, it's kind of a brief explanation of what these angels are doing in Isaiah 6, but it's not a 8 stanza strophic hymn that they're singing. It is a song that's got a great deal of repetition. It goes straight. It's not a shotgun blast with lots of different pellets. It's a single rifle shot. It's got a single idea, holiness of God, which is overwhelming, and the angels are just fixated on that. I find that hard to say that that's shallow theology.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's when people make that kind of claim that it is shallow, they fail to understand that music has multiple functions.
Mm.
Conveyance of creedal positions or denominational ethos is just one particular function of music making, right? Because music has different functions. It can be doxological, it can be teaching, educational, it can be prophetic, it can also accompany ritual making. So I'm just mentioning four in terms of what a music actually does for a worship event. So the thing is, if you want only the worship to be a doctrinal function or creedal function, you are negating the four other functions that's very important. Why do you think our worship services consist of both word and music making? And it's almost like 50% either way. And the hymn of the welcome, the first song that we sing, it always mirrors or tries to be like the call to worship kind of thing. It is not a prayer hymn. It is a doxological hymn. It's a different kind of text. We don't sing, we normally sing holy, holy, holy. But we don't sing just as I am as your opening hymn. Whoever programs that as an opening hymn deserves to be prosecuted because they don't understand the function of the first hymn. And for example, so there are different functions of the music in a particular worship service. So I think we need to be sensitive to this.
Swee Hong, have I told you the exercise I now do in my basic intro class? That's a lot of fun.
No, tell me.
It's a homework assignment. I make the students watch a musical, a movie all the way through, Sound of Music, something like that. And they have to come up with their own labels on all the different ways they see music being used in the musical.
Oh, that's great.
And it's analogous to what you just said.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
And it's not a single, and then we use that as a launching point to talk about the various roles of music in a Christian worship service.
Yeah. Right. And even, for example, if they claim, for some people say, oh, no, we need to sing Blessed Assurance, it's a much better approach, then I would challenge them and say, look, if you were in the camp meeting tradition of the 17th, 18th century, you will discover that it is a soloist that sing all the stanzas. And the people who are intent and gathering basically just sing the chorus, which is an 8-measure piece of music. So
interesting.
Let's be real. I mean, the music has different functions, and until we understand the function of the music in its particular setting, it is very naive to say all music needs to be 8 stanzas. Let's get real. Charles Wesley's hymn texts are always in 20 stanzas. We don't even do 20 stanzas because those 20 stanzas basically expound a theological concept or theological position. Mm-hmm. So if we really want to be authentic and dogmatic in the approach of hymn singing, then we need to sing 20 stanzas of the opening hymn. I don't think our congregation will take that.
Yeah.
we are really struggling with 5. Don't say 20 stanzas.
Definitely. Yeah. What would you say is the benefit of contemporary praise and worship courses? I think we've already touched on some of it there. But if someone came to you and said, why should we sing contemporary praise and worship courses instead of just singing some of these old, tried and true hymns?
for me, there are two functions that we need to look at. And I want to touch on what my professor Michael Horn mentions. Music has two giant genres. One is what we call a sequential genre. Sequential basically means it goes from one line to the next line and opens up a theological idea. The other one is what we call a cyclical genre, and cyclical genre basically uses music to engage an emotional response. So it touches the heart, the soul, the emotion aspect of a person, whereas the sequential genre touches the mind, the thought, the rational aspect. And way back in the early church already, there's always these two genres of music that are in tension, that are held together. So, for example, a praise and worship chorus is similar to a Taizé chant that we have. If you're familiar with Taizé, it is cyclical. It is repeated many, many times because, and for example, like what Lester pointed out, Isaiah chapter 6, holy, holy, holy. When you begin to get into this particular kind of music making, you are basically opening yourself to the presence of God. It is a felt response rather than a thought response. I think that's important. What I'm saying is this: if any church service only chooses one side, then you are shortchanging your congregation. You need both types of music. I think if a well-balanced diet would include protein, carbohydrates, whatever, right? So same thing for a well-balanced worship services or well-balanced worship, you need both types of music making in the event so that you're strengthened, not just your heart, but your mind is also strengthened so that we are formed holistically as a person. I think that's important. So the trick is, how can we as leaders in this particular work of God bring balance to those, to our people? If you only know all your worship songs and you do not know your hymns, then you are handicapped. You need to be versatile in both sides. I think that's important.
That's good.
I've got a little bit different answer. Did I cut you off, Swee Hong?
No, go ahead. Yeah, fine.
So if the question is about, what does the praise and worship songs do well, or what's their benefit? A completely different sort of answer. I think they highlight how two fundamental building blocks of worship, or two fundamental dispositions of the soul towards God, are just absolutely critical: praising God and loving God. That's what those songs excel in. And there's, whether we look at it historically, theologically, or scripturally, there's just absolutely essentials: praising God and loving God.
How do contemporary praise and worship, how does it do it differently than what traditional hymns do? Because don't traditional hymns praise and love God, help us to do that?
They do. Some of them do. But I think the manner of speech was more indirect. And so, particularly earlier contemporary praise and worship songs tended to be a little bit more direct.
Sure.
Laurie Klein, I love you, Lord. Opening words, that's pretty direct.
Yeah.
Okay. I exalt thee, I exalt thee, I exalt thee, O Lord. That's pretty direct. There's no missing.
That's right.
What the point is. And I think it's one of the reasons sometimes there's a lack of comfort with one genre or corpus of song than the other. Hymns require patience and the willingness to do things indirectly. Contemporary worship songs want intensity and directness. And so if you bring the wrong expectations to the other body of songs, you're going to misinterpret it and misread how it actually gets it done. You know, I'm not sure I've ever laid out this theory of mine before Swee Hong, so he may shoot the whole thing down, but that's okay. This is how I understand it. Does that make sense? This
I think
kind
so.
of expectations of songs. You don't, if you're a natural English speaker, you don't bring your understanding of how grammar works, how English grammar works, to if you're trying to learn Korean, because English grammar doesn't work if you're trying to learn Korean, and vice versa. So, I mean, hymns do it. Not all hymns do. Oh goodness. Well, I guess. I mean, I thought of this old gospel song. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses. That's actually a love song about Christ.
Yeah.
But just notice how kind of subtle and indirect it is, and wraps it up in a story much differently than you are here mending every heart. I worship you. I worship you. I mean, that's very direct and to the point.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's good. Now, over the years, as you were doing your research and studies on contemporary praise and worship, what are some of the things that surprised you? Did you have any surprises or
Oh yeah.
compliments or things?
You want me to go first, Swing Hong, or do you
Go
want to go?
ahead, Lester.
Well, two come to mind. One, just to be surprised by how critical grappling with the Bible was
Mhm.
to the fullness of the story.
Mhm.
You know, not to blow our own trumpet, but no one else has really tried to tell that story. And once, you know, once we saw it, it was obvious.
Wow.
And it's obvious when you realize these are Protestants developing this way of worship. I mean, what's foundational to Protestant sensibility?
Yeah.
The Bible.
Yep.
You know, why the Bible had never been part of any of the history before. It's interesting. The other big surprise was discovering important figures, just absolutely critical, who are now overlooked or unknown.
Oh, wow.
So I was talking to a fellow we actually interviewed for the book, Tom Kreuter,
Hmm.
for some research I'm doing on a fellow named Judson Cornwall.
Okay.
And if you were in this world in the 70s and 80s, even into the early 90s, Judson Cornwall is the man.
Mm.
He sold over 500,000 copies of books on praise and worship,
Yeah.
and traveled around the world 100,000 miles a year teaching on it. Wrote 50 books. I mean, he is the guy. He's the go-to guy, especially in the 70s and 80s. And Tom Kreuter was telling me he doubts there's any worship leader under the age of 35 or 40 who's probably heard of him.
Right.
But if you're wondering who poured the concrete to lay the foundation, it is definitely Judson Cornwall helping to lay that foundation and smooth the concrete
Mm.
that the big people of the 90s and the early aughts built on. But who knows Judson Cornwall, or the four guys who were the instigators for the first large-scale conference-based training of worship leaders?
Yeah.
Barry and Steve Griffin, David Fisher, and Larry Dempsey. I mean, there's names that no one knows, but they're holding how to do praise and worship conferences, attracting thousands of people in the early 80s, when this is all brand new across American evangelicalism and Protestantism. Or Joseph Garlington.
Oh, yeah.
Again, a name that no early young worship leader would know, but this,
There he is.
yes, you know, still pastoring in Pittsburgh. He's an elderly man now.
Mhm.
but wrote books, but he was a main worship leader at the Promise Keeper rallies in the
Right.
1990s.
That's how I got connected with him and got this. Is because
You
I
know,
attended
so
Promise Keepers.
so some people's first image of what it meant to lead worship musically
Yeah.
would have been Joseph Garlington.
Right.
But who, I don't want you to tell your age, but you're not a 20-something worship leader, Steve.
No, I'm not.
So you're of that next generation up, and you
Yeah.
so the folks coming through the worship leader degree programs right now at Liberty or um, wherever,
Yeah.
um, there's such a urgency to learn the skills of worship leading well. Um, they're not going to take time to do all the grunt work to find these significant figures of the task.
Sure.
So
Well, for me, one of the things that lesson I really discovered interesting was Ken Henry and
Ken
his
Henry,
magazine.
yes.
I mean, if you ever had somebody who began the groundwork of documenting what was happening in North America in this praise and worship movement, you need to turn to Ken Henry. Lester can tell you more.
He's one of the first kind of fellows who organizes. He's your predecessor, Stephen. Okay, so think mid 80s, worship leader creates his own educational network, conferences, speaking engagements, and develops the first widespread magazine to inform and train worship leaders called The Psalmist.
Oh yeah.
Now he's still active. He lives outside of St. Louis. But again, he's another one of the guys pouring the concrete and smoothing it out that the current state of things are just resting on. Lamar Boschman is probably another one, don't you think?
Yeah.
This Jimmy Carroll Owens, the whole kind of plethora of composers, teachers, pastors of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially. That's one of the things I hope people will pick up the book and read, just so they could be introduced to a lot of really new, interesting characters.
Yeah, that's
good. Come and meet new friends.
Yeah, for sure.
Who love the same thing that you love.
And like what Lester said, right? I mean, the thing is, even though we just focus on North America, a lot of the people that he mentioned, Judson Cornwall, Ken Henry, they had the influences that seeped overseas as well. So you find that the whole idea of how did the praise and worship training get started in Southeast Asia? Well, it's because of one, Jimmy and Carol Owens, who were connected with YWAM, and they went over there as missionaries, short-term missionaries. And then they came to my church and says, we want to introduce this workshop series. Would you be interested to host us? Well, sure, we'll host you. And then we have 10,000 people registered to attend this workshop.
Wow.
And that it just grew. So things like this explodes in Southeast Asia. We began, and when Lester decided to look for Psalmist magazine, where can we get my hands on this? I said, well, you can come to the archive in Singapore. We have some of these issues there.
Really?
Yeah. Swee Hong, they were his own copies. He was a subscriber to Psalmist magazine.
Nice
Magazine. So we spent a day in Wesley Methodist Church in downtown Singapore, scanning Swee Hong's own copies of this magazine.
Yeah, we have that, and the Anglican Church would host Dave and Dale Garrett, and they started in Australia the Scripture and Song movement. So we have that. When we started researching, and I learned that they got those liturgical dances out in Oregon. Well, we had that in Southeast Asia too. So the thing is that And there are people who, like what Lester says, they are building bridges from
Yeah.
North America to the rest of the world. And so
Yeah.
these are the people that you will get to read about in this particular book.
And today it's become so much easier to have this global connection, right?
Oh, yeah.
Just through Zoom or through the internet.
Yeah. That's right.
But the global connection is there from the get-go, at least on the praise and worship Psalm 22:3 side.
Yeah.
You asked us what the most surprising thing was that we learned. My mind has shifted over to the most fun aspects of doing this book.
Okay.
And I think it was getting to meet and talk to amazing people. So like the global thing, we didn't end up utilizing his material, but there was a missionary, Dennis Balcom, strong commitment to Hong Kong and mainland China. So learning his story and how he's been bringing praise and worship to that part of Asia since the 1960s.
Wow.
Befriending, making friends with Howard Roshinsky, the founder of CCLI,
Nice.
who happened to have grown up in the church of the Pentecostal minister who first developed the Psalm 22:3. So, when we connected with him, I think Howard was thinking, oh, they're going to ask me about CCLI, the normal set of questions. No, we didn't ask him anything about CCLI. We asked him about his childhood. And about growing up in that church and about this pastor whom he still remembers very fondly.
Nice.
And eventually we ended up talking about CCLI.
Yeah.
But I think we surprised him a little bit. We've just met, who composed As the Deer?
Oh, Marty Nystrom.
Yeah. So I did a solo interview with him. You weren't part of it, sweetheart.
No, yeah.
And I found out, because I was trying to find out information about Christ for the Nations, the Pentecostal school in Dallas. He was a student there. That's where he wrote the song. And the song's almost a lark. He wasn't quite sure he wanted to be at that school. He had kind of halfway followed a girl there. And then he got there and she promptly just broke up the relationship between the two. And so he's stuck in Dallas. And someone suggested to him, it might have been the girl herself, why don't you just read through the Psalms systematically? So he started this rotation of reading through the Psalms systematically, doing so with his Bible open and his guitar on his lap. And that's where the first verse of As the Deer comes from.
Yeah.
He can tell you exactly what day of the week and of the month it was, because he can calculate it based on where is it, Psalm 42?
Yep.
Where that would have fallen in his systematic reading through of the Psalms on a monthly basis.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Oh, going back to the surprise question. Sorry about this.
No, you're good.
I think what would be surprising to a lot of the readers, and I was surprised by it somewhat. It's not a dominant theme in our book. Much of the early songwriting was done very innocently like that, or organically.
Yeah.
The song that you referenced earlier, "Awesome God." The reason that the language is so colloquial there is that composer was driving late at night and he was trying to keep himself awake. So he rolled down his car windows and he tried to imitate radio preachers just to keep himself occupied.
I didn't know that. That's great.
And, when he stopped the car, he said, I've got some usable lyrics here.
Yeah, there you go.
As mechanized and industrialized as a lot of songwriting is now, it would surprise people, just to almost innocent, organic.
Yeah.
Perhaps the biggest surprise is that in the early top 25 CCLI list, there's a song that's anonymously written.
Oh, yeah.
what a mighty God we serve.
Mhm.
Angels bow before him, heaven and earth adores him. What I know you, Stephen, you're already thinking through the chords for the song as soon as I
Mhm.
start mentioning the lyrics. Is that not right?
That's right. Yeah.
We have that's on the early top CCLI list. We have no idea who composed it. Try to imagine an anonymously written song today
Yeah.
making the top 25 CCLI list.
I can't. Yeah.
No, you can't.
Right. Well,
Sweet Hong, I've fallen back into dominating the conversation again. I apologize.
Carry on, my friends.
well, Swee Hong, maybe you can be the first one to answer this as we begin to wrap up our time. Do you have any sense as to where we are going from here in terms of contemporary praise and worship, music, stylings? Where are we going based on your study? Or can we even answer that question?
um, that's a hard question.
Yeah.
Um, I like to follow trend. I like to be able to see where the trajectory takes us. Right now, I'm not clear, but I do see inkling of what we talked about earlier on about the desire to look back and see what where have we come from,
Mhm.
and what can serve as a foundational stone for us to move forward. So
Yeah.
I remember I mentioned to you that I've detected that Hillsong is beginning to pick up ancient texts. Anastasis, Michael W. Smith is looking at Agnus Dei. So I
Yes.
suspect what I've learned from our professor James White is that Christian worship is like a pendulum.
Mm.
It swings from the past to the present, and then it swings back to the past again. So
Sure.
I suspect, I'm just speculating, maybe in the future, we will begin to take our past heritage seriously, and we may begin to start looking at uh, more liturgical form of expression of contemporary praise and worship.
Wow.
I mean, already right now we have this tongue-in-cheek term, traditional contemporary worship. Yes,
Mhm. That's true.
I
The
suspect there's going to be
modern
more.
hymns.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
So we're beginning to see more of that coming up. I suspect.
Right.
That's what I'll say.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Sui Hong. Our last episode that we did, which would be season 2, episode 5, was on that very topic of ancient future worship. And we discussed that idea of everything that's happening now, and as we look to the future, the road to that runs through the past.
That's right.
Which comes from, Robert Weber, who
right.
was doing much of this contemporary praise and worship idea in the 70s, 80s, 90s, right?
My mantra for my class on congregational song is there's nothing new under the sun.
Oh, yeah.
What was maybe 2 generations ago, we're going to experience it next generation.
Yeah.
They will find it exciting and new, but it's actually, it's nothing new.
And that's not just with music and worship, right? But clothing and hairstyles and all of it.
Bell-bottom pants is coming back.
Exactly.
I'm telling you, my friends.
That's right. That's right. Lester, do you have any idea of maybe how to answer where are we going from here?
I have a guess.
Okay.
And I think the pandemic has accentuated the trajectory or given it, and it's the role of technology in worship in multiple ways and in multiple dimensions. So, in terms of ancient future, reference of Robert Weber, he would talk about ancient future in terms of content and style, that basic structure itself. But what we've been playing around here at Duke, and where our creative thought is, me and my kind of worship cohort here, do we need to reappraise older ways of participation? Is there something in particular to learn from the Middle Ages in terms of enhancing participation of the worshiper who might have the service mediated by the screen? and I know I'm having to reappraise some of my categories. I'm all for congregational singing. That's just a rule of thumb that I teach. And I was all for that until I had to start watching services mediated, well, in fact, by this very screen right in front of me right here. And it's like, I'm not singing along because I don't want to hear myself sing.
Mm.
So the screen was making me passive.
Interesting.
But I started thinking, but you know, there are other ways of participation from the Middle Ages that didn't presume everybody had to be doing the same thing at the same time, that there could be parallel activity. So we've been creating a online worship participation guide here that we're going to begin experimenting with and trying out in a limited setting. And it really shifts the expectation
Mm.
about what it means to participate. Whether or not it goes any place, I don't know, but we're not swinging the pendulum all the way back to an untechnological way of worship.
Sure.
So figuring out the best way to achieve certain fundamental norms
Mm-hmm.
will be the question for the future.
Yeah, that's good. Great. Yeah, technology, that's a big shift when it comes to maybe this idea of the traditional way of worshiping versus this contemporary mindset, right?
Yeah, and I think all the churches that had to figure out some way to stream their services or put them on Facebook or record them and allow online access, I think a lot of people have discovered some potential upsides to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And that's a big change from the overhead projector.
absolutely. And I know I haven't been good about equipping my students to think through their planning and leading of worship, presuming
Mm.
that they have to take that into account.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Well, thank you both for being here. As we finish up, do you have any final words? What would you say to people that are watching this? Maybe a summary statement.
this will sound like a commercial. Is this okay? I can tell people where the cheapest place to find the book is.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Don't go to the normal online retailer whose name begins with an A.
Okay.
Go straight to bakerbookhouse.com.
Okay.
And they consistently have had the largest discount
Great.
on the book.
I'll put that link in the notes of this video. Yeah. Good. Swee Hong, do you have any final words to share with us as we close?
As we move through the 21st century, Christianity always wonders what it means to be Christian in a very postmodern, in a secular world. I think having to know how our history will help us be better prepared to engage the world, particularly if we are concerned about being in the marketplace, in the world. What does it mean for us as Christians? I think knowing our history is important. So get a copy of the book. If you're in praise and worship, know your history. Very critical.
Yeah, for sure.
Can I add one last thing, Stephen?
Absolutely, please.
Anybody who's listening and is possibly contemplating further graduate work and would like to study contemporary praise and worship, do talk to Swee Hong and me. Our goal is not just to run the race by ourselves, but to train up a younger generation of scholars that we can pass the baton to. This book is only the first book that needs to be written. It's not the last book.
Good. Yeah, good word. Lester, will you pray us out?
Sure.
Close us in a time of prayer. Thank you.
Lord, since the earliest centuries, when your people have gathered at the Lord's table, there are some words that we've said that it is good, right, and always and everywhere appropriate to give praise and thanks to you. That was true in the first century. That is true in the current century. And we do give you thanks and praise for every benefit, for every grace, for every miracle, for every gracious thing that you have done to call us, create us, redeem, and save us. Lead your people and fill their mouths with your praise so that your name might be lifted up and your gospel spread across the world. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.